Welcome, everyone, to the international book launch of National Identity: Confessions of an Outsider by Simon Bridges. We are delighted as Conservative Friends of the Commonwealth to be hosting this event and to have the author and our patron, Simon Bridges, with us today. I'd like to start with, how are you today, Simon?
Hey, I'm great, Sunil, and thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it. I appreciate that you are, because we're at literally opposite ends of the world. I'm at relatively good time, at sort of 8 in the evening over here, but you're sort of not early, but early-ish morning. So thank you very much for having me on.
No, it's great to have you on. For those who haven't read the book, I do thoroughly recommend it. It's a great read, and it's now available to purchase on Amazon. I suppose let's get right into it, if you like. What made you write this book? As you point out, it's not a political memoir, and I know we've talked during the process of you writing this book, but I guess I kind of want to know how the origin started of you constructing this book.
Well, we're right now in September 2021. And so it was, look, around this time last year, actually, maybe a little later. And I had just not long before that lost the leadership of the National Party, the equivalent of the Conservative Party in Britain. We were in the middle of COVID, as the whole world was, and we actually had an election coming up. And I was sitting there, I suppose, for the first time in my political career, having been a member of parliament for 12 or so years at that point in time. I had some time. I wasn't trying to become a cabinet minister. I wasn't trying to become leader. I'd been there, done those things. And so, yeah, I had this space. And I'd already started, maybe a decade before that, writing a memoir. I read back some of that, and it was a bit juvenile. Frankly, I didn't like it that much, but I knew I had something in me, and it was a great self-help for me actually over the Christmas period to, I hope this doesn't sound wrong, but bang it out because it was in me. It was things I wanted to say, and yeah, that's kind of why I did it. It wasn't a difficult process, and so from starting writing through to publication, primarily physically in New Zealand, but around the world as well. It's been less than a year.
Wow, so there's so many great chapters in the book. I'm going to start with race. I think that's the first chapter. I found it so fascinating. It's probably one of my favorite bits in the book. You talked about, I'm going to pronounce this, I'm sure, completely wrong, but you talked about being too married to be Paeka and
Pakeha, yeah, which
Pakeha.
is
Okay,
effectively, I'm not sure if this is politically correct either, but uh, uh, white, Caucasian,
okay,
European. Yeah,
okay.
what the Maori would refer to, but a very common, if you like, anglicised word in New Zealand. Everyone knows there's Maori and there's Pakeha. Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned in the book that you're too married to be Pākehā or too Pākehā to be Maori. How was that in terms of growing up? I think we can probably start with there, because I look at it, and the reason why I enjoyed that section of the book so much, I think I could kind of identify with it being British Indian. And I remember, you have the kind of dilemma: are you British? Are you Indian? And there's moments in your life where you feel very Indian. There's very moments in your life you feel very British. How was that? How did you deal with that growing up initially?
Well, I think growing up, like as a kid, I went to a school that would be very recognisable to you in London or much of the UK. It was very multicultural, Polynesian because we're in New Zealand and we're in the South Pacific, Pacific Islanders, Maori, also a lot of European kids, a lot of Asian children from all around the Pacific Rim, if you like. And we didn't think about that much. My best mate was a young guy who was Samoan. There were great mates who were white kids, Maori kids, an Asian kid, and we were colorblind, if you want to put it that way. in my family, for reasons of history, which I can, I suppose, summarise for you briefly. My grandmother was Naku Joseph. She was a Maori off a marae. That is a sort of a cultural, rural place for Maori. She spoke fluent Maori. But she at that time, 100 years ago now, she determined that actually, in colonial New Zealand back then, there was nothing to be had from being Maori. And so you were best placed to assimilate or frankly, worse than that, act Pākehā, act white. And so my dad then grew up with that. And so we were colorblind. We didn't think about these things. It wasn't a thing being Maori or Pākehā. But what did happen as I got older, and in fact, really more than ever in politics, is you're forced to think about these things. And in New Zealand, I'm sure is similar in the UK, albeit in a different way, with Asian British. There's been a renaissance. And now actually everyone is, many are proud to speak te reo, that is the Maori language. There's a renaissance in people getting what we call moko, tattoos on their face that are traditional, all of these things. But that was never my experience. And so I suppose I felt, and I did in politics as a Conservative member of Parliament, where this hasn't, Maori and the National Party haven't consistently, conveniently been, strong bedfellows. I was kind of too Maori, not enough Maori, too Pākehā, not enough Pākehā. It was a very confusing thing. And, the media in New Zealand, they had a bit of a sense that, well, you're either a real Maori who speaks the language, is on a marae and has the traditional kind of things going along with it, and therefore part of the Labour Party, or you're not a real Maori, or worse, maybe you're a sort of an Uncle Tom. So I'm sorry, I've gone way off your question, but growing up, didn't think about it too much. There, I suppose, was a little bit of casual, unthinking racism, not massive. New Zealand is, I think, as far as countries go, very unracist. But then later, it became a thing. And it was certainly a thing for me as leader of the National Party, because I was the first Maori leader of one of the big two that had the chance, if you like, of becoming New Zealand's Prime Minister in our history.
It's really, you've touched on so many things I would like to go in further with. The Maori side of being being Maori and being the leader of the National Party. I think it's quite similar to what a lot of, if you like, British Asians, British Indians, British Pakistani people get with the Conservative Party in the UK. So Priti Patel, we had recently on our platform, who received almost appalling abuse. It's almost he's a wrong kind of Indian in some ways. So there's that kind of argument where we have this term, and I'm sure it's similar in New Zealand, shy conservatives, and I think it's even more apparent in sort of ethnic minority groups in this country, and I'm sure it's similar for a lot of Maoris in New Zealand. Yes. Since your prominence, your rise in politics, did you see a shift in change? Do you think there were more Maoris that were voting National Party?
Well, it's very complicated, and of course, well, not of course, but it is the case that if you go back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, actually, on occasion, National would do well with Maori.
All right.
But the basic story, that I'm simplifying somewhat, but the basic story and the sense of New Zealand's media landscape would be, you know what, if you're Labour, you vote Maori. And so therefore, as you say, and as you've seen in the Conservatives in the United Kingdom, with ethnic minority members of Parliament, to be on the other side, that's sort of a betrayal. And it's somehow the case that you can't be Maori and a Tory. That sort of does. Real Maori, as I say, they speak the language, they go along with some of the traditions, and their labour. And I would get that in Parliament at a sense. And you know, of course, in the end, that's absolutely ridiculous. It's like the view that if you're a Scotsman or woman, you still have to be in a kilt and love haggis and, you know, all of these other things and be drinking, I don't know, single malts every day or something, which wouldn't be bad necessarily. But, you know, a Scotsman or woman can be SNP, Labour, Conservative, have all manner of different viewpoints, but there's this sort of stereotype with Maori in New Zealand, as I'm sure from what you're saying is true in the United Kingdom for ethnic minorities around politics. One final thing I would say, and this is, you know, complicated perhaps for people looking outside from Britain into New Zealand. But in New Zealand, for reasons of history and the like, and you know, we could discuss how principled it is, but there are two ways to vote if you're Maori, in a way that if you're any other New Zealander is not the case. You can vote on the Maori roll for effectively Maori only candidates, and there are 6 or 7, I should know how many, whether it's 6 or 7 geographical large seats for Maori on that roll. Or you can be like me, a Maori on the general roll, who votes in the general seat. And in my case, I'm the member of Parliament for a place called Tauranga, and so I vote as a general roll person, even though I'm Maori and I could vote on the Maori roll in the seat of Tauranga. And here's the point I simply wanted to make of that. In our small country of 5 or so million people, there's about 500,000, actually it's more than that, but 500,000 voting Maori. About half, 250,000, are on the Maori roll. And by the way, they at a rate of 90 or something % vote Labour. And a small group, I'm simplifying hugely, but vote for a party called the Maori Party, which is a Maori self-determination party, if you like, about Maori pride and so on. But on the general roll, where there's another 250,000 voters, as I say, they're Maori like me. And disproportionately, we vote national in the same or higher numbers as other New Zealanders. So you wouldn't have that sense if you picked up a newspaper or the television in New Zealand. You would think Maori, it's Labour and maybe a bit Maori Party, but actually that's a gross simplification. There's plenty of Maori like me who are capitalists, individualists, a bunch of other ists that maybe don't fit with traditional Maori worldview, but I think is our right. And one of the points I'm making in the book is really to other Maori, to the media and so on, is, you know what, I'm every bit as much a Maori as someone with a full face moko who speaks fluent te reo, even though I don't do things. And that's by virtue of my bloodlines, or as we would say in New Zealand, our whakapapa, and because I identify as such.
I think you've raised some really interesting points. We again, talking of race and stuff, we've had this chat a lot on here, and we often say that in some ways it's almost more racist to say that we should think or vote a certain way because we're Maori, we're Indian, than any sort of racial slur. Like it's almost like a mental slavery kind of thing that, you know, just because you're Maori and you're a bit darker, you should be voting a certain way. Do you think there is a change? Do you think you'll get, like, for example, in this country, we're getting a lot, you can see in our cabinet how many British Indians there are, for example. You can see there is a real swift change now where I think ethnic groups are more happy to say that they're voting Conservative going on social media. Is that changing in New Zealand? Because in the book, it seems like you're suggesting it is.
I think so. I think I look, and I don't claim to be an expert, but I try and keep up, as I love the UK. I look with a real sense of admiration at how things have gone in the United Kingdom, where my sense is traditionally Asian British have voted Labour in higher numbers, and that's still at a level the case. But if you look at Boris Johnson's cabinet, excuse me, as you say, whether it's Priti Patel, whether it's your Chancellor, whether it's a raft of others, it's an incredible story. I feel like them, in as much as I feel, as I'm sure Priti does and others do, I'm there and I became a cabinet minister, one of the most senior in New Zealand, on merit, right? It wasn't because there was a quota. It wasn't some other, I got into law school, I did this, that, and the other thing on the basis of merit. I don't want to be the diversity candidate. In New Zealand, I think it's changing. I think, as is true all around the world, as groupings, and Maori are no different in this regard, share the benefits of a strong economy and become more middle class and obtain higher educations and the like. We're free to choose, and National has a very proud record on Maori issues, race relation issues. We have a treaty of Waitangi signed back in the days of Queen Victoria, and we've talked about this before, you and I. But what that means is there is a treaty grievance settlement process. National has the best record on that. So I think it is changing. I think even, dare I say it, this is probably slightly pompous and I might regret it, but I think even, dare I say it, my book and that chapter starts to just in gently prodding and challenging the media helps with people realizing, you can't kind of pigeonhole Maori over there as Labour, could never be a Tory, could never be on the Conservative side of the fence.
I think that moves nicely on to the next part of the book, nationality. And it's interesting, you talk quite a lot about your British heritage, which I'm sure a lot of the Brits tuning in will enjoy. If you'd like to talk more about that, because there's some really interesting sort of findings that you speak about in the book.
Well, the amazing thing is, Sunil, is that I've now done many interviews, as you might imagine, in New Zealand. I haven't talked about that chapter in any of them. And so, at one level, in a New Zealand context where, obviously I will sell the most books, it's not, it's perhaps glossed over. But I put it in a chapter on nationality and really my sense of my British, and more specifically English whakapapa or heritage, because it's part of my identity. Just for a second, actually, if I might, the book's title, National Identity, look, it's in a New Zealand sense, of course, it's a pun, probably a bad one at a level, because it's a play on words. The party I've been a member of parliament for a long time now is the National Party. I've been on an identity nationally, so that's that national identity. But I'm trying in all of these chapters to work out my own identity. It's been cathartic for me in that regard, and also say something about, other New Zealanders. And actually what you're suggesting, which I love, is that, there's resemblances probably with other Commonwealth countries. We are English speaking, we've had migrants and so on. Other people will pick up things as well. So the second chapter, maybe you'd say then the second most important, is about the fact that, okay, one of my grandparents, Naku Joseph, was Māori. Actually, it's a bit more complicated than that. You can read the book and work out the rest of her heritage, but it was Maori. 3 of them are from the UK and are basically, I'm sorry if this is unkind to your compatriots, but bread and butter English, right? And what I'm grappling with is the fact that I feel that, right? I feel English. My wife, Natalie, is from Coventry. Her dad's Welsh, her mum's Polish. I'd like to think in a way, in terms of my heritage, I'm more English than she is. 3 of my grandparents have their forebears and ancestors going back many, many hundreds of years through Norwich and Warwickshire and Yorkshire and Lancashire. You know, there's a little place I've been to, not in the recent past actually, but Barnoldswick up in what is I think now Lancashire, but was Yorkshire, where in the cemetery, literally the oldest gravestones are those of the Baxters from my mum's family. And so, you know, I feel this deep connection. Your history is my history. But then, a bit like I've said to you with my Maori DNA, I'm not Maori enough to Maori. It's hard to work out for, you know, New Zealanders in a complicated age. A bit the same is true with my Englishness, if that's such a word. I feel English because I'm not. I don't have a passport. I don't speak like a Brit. You know, I have this thick Kiwi accent that's one of the most recognizable in even New Zealand for being just a real product of this land. And you know now, and I could pick on many different, but let's take my wife's heritage, a Polish mum in the United Kingdom. There are many such Brits now with Polish DNA and ancestry who have passports and perhaps live in Barnoldswick and don't have the heritage I have, but are every bit actually more British than I am. And so when I think of, here's another Maori word for you, if nothing else, your listeners are going to get an education in Maori language. We talk about turanga waiwai, which is effectively our place of standing, where in the land we come from and we are part of. And maybe I'm being greedy when I want to have where my grandmother came from in a place called the King Country in New Zealand, West Auckland, where I grew up, Tauranga, which I represent now, as well as Barnoldswick and some of these other places. I'm from there. It's part of me, my history, but there's a very real sense which that's not me anymore. And I'm really on a roll. You've got me going now. But I mean, the one other thing I would say is, as a politician, because you're right, the book is basically not about big P politics. There's a bit, but not a massive amount. As a politician, it always saddened me when I came to London and would meet with your ministers of both Labour and Conservative persuasion, that certainly in the days when you were part of the EU, and I don't want to enter the maelstrom that is Brexit and what people think about that, because I know everyone has a different view, but there was a sense that, you know, we still felt this deep connection to what some would, in probably quite a cheesy or twee sense in New Zealand, call home in the United Kingdom, but that was gone in the UK. Your ministers, your governments were very much facing towards the EU. I do think, though, and what you're doing comes into this directly, today, regardless of your view of Brexit, one exciting thing is it does mean for little old New Zealand and Australia and Canada and but much bigger countries like India, maybe there's this turning back to the Commonwealth, countries that share not only values but heritage and history, and to use a Maori word, that whakapapa. And I'm excited about that. Yes, for reasons of nostalgia. I grew up watching Coronation Street and Emmerdale Farm because they were my mother's favourite shows, because they reminded her of where she came from. She didn't like all the sex on Coronation Street, though. I've got to tell you, Sunil, by the end of it, it was too much. It got a bit naughty for her in recent days. But so reasons of nostalgia, but also because I think with that heritage, as Britain now is no longer part of the European Union, there's a chance for us in common interest in a modern world to do a whole lot more together. And your organisation, but also the likes of Kanzuk and so on, I think we're onto something.
For sure, it's good to speak so well on the Commonwealth, and I think naturally, you've mentioned the B word in Brexit, and I think naturally we should hopefully see a shift towards Commonwealth countries. I think one of the things we've started talking about is almost diversifying your portfolio as well. And why not diversify your portfolio to countries, like you said, that have the same heritage and history as ourselves? And I think it can be a lot more than that. You touched on that in the book as well. In terms of being more than just a sort of a trading block. I think there's a lot more that can be said and done. Just finishing off on nationality, because in the book it feels like it's almost you're having a conversation at times with yourself. It almost seems like at points where you're almost still trying to figure out your almost identity. And I want to ask, and of course you have this internal, if you like, conflict and battle with your nationality, your race. How has that been for you, and what is it like on the outside? So naturally, you mentioned later on in the book about how the media and being involved in politics, you're almost forced to confront this. Has that at times been more difficult when coming from the outside, whether it's the media, whether it's the people, just generally social media, almost trying to pin you to an identity? Has that played a part in this sort of internal conflict, if you like?
Oh, definitely. And, I suppose I wanted to be very raw and real in the book because I think that, when we talk about those Maori issues, others will identify. And, I'm repeating myself, what I find so pleasing is even, what is it, 15,000 miles or something away, it has if not a resemblance, a resonance
For sure.
there. And I think there will be hundreds of thousands of Maori New Zealanders who have a sense of that. I think I did struggle, and becoming leader of a big political party, and much smaller, of course, in the United Kingdom context, where you have such a spectrum of media and the scrutiny is intense. But even in a small democracy with different newspapers, different radio stations, television networks, and so on, you have some of that. It forced the fact that I hadn't worked through some of this stuff in my own head out into the open. I didn't have a good answer, in a sense, that was satisfying for me, at least, about my Maori heritage, about my nationality, about, whether I was a Maori Kiwi, just a Kiwi, Maori Pākehā Kiwi with British ancestry. And this book's helped me do that. But what I hope is also helps others think about these big issues and, if you like, improve themselves. And also because I think, identity is the issue of our times. It's we're no longer in caves or running around hunting wild animals or being hunted by wild animals. We think about, who am I? Where do I come from? Where are we going? As a tribe, as a small nation at the bottom of the Pacific, or as a rather bigger one, a middle a power with an amazing history in the United Kingdom. What do all those little identities mean as a collective, as I say, tribal whole? And one of the things I think is, the more I think about it, is my issues, struggling with where I'm at as a Maori New Zealander, they are at a level New Zealand's issues, right? Because all those little identities, they make up the whole. My issues with my masculinity, another thing I talk about in the book, they end up being often common issues for a bunch of New Zealanders, and so on and so on.
I actually really enjoyed your masculinity passage in the book. It sounds strange, being a bit of a sort of sports fanatic that I am. I really liked the fact that you were so open and honest about how you don't follow sort of the National League, I think is what we'd say, of rugby, the sort of the regular non, if like international domestic sport. Because one of the things that I think annoys a lot of people in this country, I know for me, for example, is I'm a massive football fan of soccer, as I say, in New Zealand, and sometimes you get politicians on both sides, whether it's Labour or Conservative, who will be commenting a lot on football, and you can just tell, being the kind of football hooligan that I am, that I can quite clearly tell that you don't follow the sport, and it is a bit of a peeve, and you're sitting there, you do get annoyed, and I'm sure there's so many others like me in this country that see that, and so it was really good to see that just acknowledgement that you follow rugby in terms of the international stage and in New Zealand in general, but it's not like a day-to-day religion like it is for a lot of us in this country in regards to football and soccer. So that was really interesting. But I want to move on to class, because that's another segment I actually particularly enjoyed as well, where especially your experiences working as a wine steward. It seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, but that almost helped you in your career later on. It gave you sort of, it seems like the social skills to communicate with different groups of people. How important was that for your sort of development as a young man coming up through New Zealand?
I think important. I mean, I am what would be considered in New Zealand terms, and again, it's perhaps somewhat jarring, because I'm, of course, a Conservative member of Parliament, but I'm working class. And I would make the point first off that working class isn't quite the same in New Zealand as in the United Kingdom. I think our class distinctions in New Zealand are less clear cut, more soft than they are, dare I say it, as a non-Brit, as in Britain, where my sense is they are much sharper lines, and it is much more of a thing built up over, dare I say it, centuries. Right? That's not true in New Zealand. New Zealand, given our rather short history as a country, like Aussie, maybe a bit like America, where we wanted to get away from that stuff. And so it's very, at least aspirationally, egalitarian, right? But, and it is a big but, those class distinctions have grown. And even if it's not like the United Kingdom, where you had lords and ladies for centuries, through to the common folk, in New Zealand, just as anywhere, where you have distinctions based on money, address, where house price inflation in New Zealand is probably as much as anywhere in the world, and the suburbs in my city are as expensive as many in London, despite the fact it's small and doesn't have the earning capacity of incomes anything like London. You get class at a level. So I grew up in a place called West Auckland. I don't know what an example of, or what the analogy of that would be in British terms. It's a bit rough, tough council estate. I wouldn't overplay it, but it was working class. It had Labour members of Parliament, and that was that. And so I was, growing up, a Maori Westie, which means something in New Zealand terms. Do you know what I'm talking about if I talk about a mullet?
Yeah.
I had a mullet.
Yeah.
I mean, that was where things were at in West Auckland. Most kids in my school didn't go to university. It wasn't, that wasn't where things are at. But I was smart. I had great parents. And, New Zealand was then, I think it's changing sadly, but still a country where anyone could get a very good education, a very good health system. And I had the benefit of all of that. And so I got myself into the best university, the best law school in New Zealand, and I did well. But I lacked I suppose you'd say, the P's and the Q's, the social etiquette, the poise. I had no idea about these things. I ate and spoke with my mouth full. I have this accent that is, very working class in a New Zealand sense. I didn't know any lawyers. I had one older brother who'd trailblazed before me and gone to law and then actually practiced in London. But, it was not part of my story. And so I end up at university. And everyone else at law school, not everyone, but it seemed like it. They'd been to a private school or a public school, I think you'd say, in the United Kingdom. They had they had mum, dad, uncle, aunt, grandma was a lawyer. It was part of their thing, and I didn't fit in. I didn't kind of get that. I'm not saying I was unpopular, but it was just that was a struggle. There was some sense of otherness, if not outright discrimination. So I then somehow applied and got myself a job at what I suppose you'd call in the UK sense a gentleman's club, a St James or a Pall Mall, a gentleman's club. And I had to get a haircut. The mullet had to go. And I was mixing with Queen's Counsel and surgeons and knights and the higher echelon of New Zealanders at this very exclusive club. And it wasn't a finishing school, but it did kind of show me how it worked in a way I never saw where I grew up, how real business people, proper people in the higher echelon spoke and behaved with each other. And that was helpful to me. I still had a long way to go, and I talk in the book, I won't detail it, but about absolute debacles in law firms as I worked out what was going on, and I somehow by the skin of my teeth was able to keep going, and somehow became a member of parliament and a very senior one. But big steep learning curves, and I suppose my point is it's this is one part that is, as I've already said to you, very different from the UK, but even in New Zealand, we like to think we don't have class and class distinctions. It's here, and with the growth in those property prices and so on, and a bunch of New Zealanders, Maori disproportionately, other ethnic minority New Zealanders disproportionately being left out, those class distinctions are growing and growing. It's a very sad thing, and it should be an important part of what National's about, just as it is in the UK, where the Conservatives, for the first time, sometimes ever, have won seats in the north, in Wales, and we see quite a profound shift in New Zealand, like you've had in Britain, where increasingly working class New Zealanders, I think, do identify with the approach of a conservative style party in the National Party. Paradoxically, though, those urban liberal, as we would say over here, intelligentsia and professionals are moving left somewhat. And in New Zealand terms, and I say this in the book as well, the most expensive suburb in New Zealand, I'll show my ignorance of the UK. Is it a Belgravia or a Chelsea or something in your term? I mean, it's called Herne Bay in New Zealand. You can't buy a house under 2 million New Zealand dollars, and you can certainly buy one, as you can in those suburbs, for 25 million, 35 million New Zealand. It is represented by a Green Member of Parliament, which in New Zealand terms is to the left of Labour, right? And that kind of shows you what's going on in New Zealand politics as we follow a bit of what's happened in the UK and America and other English-speaking Western nations.
It's really interesting you say that, because I think with Simon O'Connor, I talked about certain parts of London being full of almost like champagne socialists, and there's almost this liberal elitism in big cities like London, New York, LA, who have such amazing wealth, and they almost I don't want to sound like I'm anti-London, because I literally live just outside of London, but I seem to be at war with a lot of them at the moment, which is this kind of, they just really don't understand what's going on in the rest of the country, like in terms of your Dovers, your Liverpools, and like you mentioned, Yorkshire and Lancashire, and they just seem so disconnected, and it seems like in our country that the Labour Party just refuses to understand that what issues in London about I can't even think of some of the issues that they
Yeah.
will talk about are really just not relevant in the milkman for Dover. I think you've used that analogy before, and it's so relevant. But you touched on something about class, and that leads quite well to something else I wanted to discuss, which was the inequality gap. You mentioned this in education, specifically in the book. It does seem quite worrying on this side of things, because I think one of the things that I think the UK has done reasonably well is the education side of things. I think you know your story is obviously a really good story, coming from working class and becoming member of parliament for National Party, and we can see that with some of the cabinet right now in England. Priti Patel, her parents owned like a corner shop, and she lives on top of that, and now she's Home Secretary. And it seems like, you know, in the UK it's not perfect, and it's definitely flawed, and there's a lot more work that can be done. But it seems like we're progressing in quite a good manner. It's interesting to see in New Zealand that doesn't quite seem to be the case with education. Just wondering if you could touch a bit more on that.
I think we've been involved, and it's, to be honest, over both blue and red as the colours of the National Party and the Labour Party in New Zealand governments. We've been in a terrible experiment on education, and the United Kingdom, and I'm no expert on the United Kingdom, but under Michael Gove, you had reforms that improved things, it seems to me, significantly in the UK. You were somewhat on this experiment as well, but you got back to teaching real knowledge by teachers, sometimes at the front of the classroom, in the core canon of education, reading, writing, maths, science, and these things. Well, New Zealand got a lot away from that. It's much more relativistic. It's child-led. It's in these big, I say unkindly, cow barns. You know, we've got a lot of cows in New Zealand, but you know, these big sheds almost, which is the modern pedagogy, to use the education word, where kids are lying around doing all sorts of things. And I'm hamming it up a bit, but that's kind of where it's gone at a level. And here's the real worry. When even I went to school 35 years ago or something, you know, what is it now, nearly 40 years ago that I started school as a 5-year-old in New Zealand, I believe anyone at any school, and this isn't some myth making, I think this is actually true, could go on to become a top surgeon or architect, or look, if what they were going to do was a plumber, you know, they would at any school in any part of New Zealand get the basics that would allow them to fulfill their God-given potential. My basic thesis is today I don't think that's true, even in my electorate. I think there are schools where, for a bunch of complex reasons, and I don't want to blame the teachers, I think it's probably in the Ministry of Education and these various other, that's no longer so. And so I fess up in the book as a working class guy who hasn't come from money. My wife and now, as successful New Zealanders, send our kids to a fancy little private school. And we do that because we can, but we want the best for them. And that's the sort of education they get there that they used to be able to get in a public state school, but they can't anymore. And so, whereas in the UK, you've gone like this, some years down and then up in these international PISA scores and the like. In New Zealand, we continue to go that well. We're not even competing with you, let alone countries of Southeast Asia like Singapore or Korea and so on, which are really at the top now and are leaving us for dead. Look, I could keep going. I won't. I could bore you with universities and the same dumbing down that's gone on there. It's a real issue for New Zealand, and some of it's cultural. I should just make this point. New Zealand is in danger of becoming this lifestyle nation. Great place to go to the beach, to come for a holiday, nice, albeit too expensive houses, all of these things. But my fear is through a sort of an insularity and a complacency, we'll no longer cut it in the way that we have in the past in science, in technology, in some of these areas. I mean, did you know, I don't know if you, but Lord Ernest Rutherford, who split the atom at Cambridge, he was a Kiwi. And, he led the science program there. We are one of the few countries in space. We have some significant technology multinationals, but increasingly I worry that with our education system, that becomes harder. And we're not like the UK and, as I say, a bunch of other countries really trying to keep up in that global contest, which education is at the heart of. I hope I don't want to depress you or anyone listening, and I shouldn't be disloyal about New Zealand. I love this country. It's got so much that's going for it, but it has got a complacency at the moment. I think that's part of where we're at as a little prosperous country at the bottom of the world, shut off with COVID, and part of my book is trying to shake New Zealanders up about some of these things because they really matter.
I think kind of moving on from education, but I suppose it links well to sort of New Zealand's standing in the world. I naturally I love the world view section in your book, and you talk about China, Russia, America. I mean, those countries alone, we could probably speak for a considerable amount of time. But I wanted to get an understanding of what you were sort of saying about how important it is for New Zealand to take a position with these countries. You kind of said how abstaining is weak, and New Zealand needs to take more of a position when it comes to, in particular, China and Russia. What did you sort of mean by that?
Well, there's a lot in it. New Zealand's a very soft country, right? You can forgive me some pop psychology, but if you think about New Zealand, it's dissimilar. I actually think Britain is a beautiful country. It's very green and verdant, and just love it. New Zealand is a green country. It's easy to live in. It's not like our Aussie mates, our cousins across the ditch, which is a big desert. With that is a harsh environment. And so, as I was just saying to you before on that education story, there is some great qualities, a kindness, a decency about New Zealanders, a softness, but there's also a complacency, an insularity. And we've done very well, thank you very much, on the back of that. Not picking sides, having an independent foreign policy, not getting too worried about some of these big issues, actually sticking pretty close to China, because it has literally been, I think, as I say in the book, the golden panda. It is, we now trade more with China than any other country, bar any, by a long way. Aussies distant back some. And that was an unalloyed good. I'm not suggesting any of this is simple, but the problem is today, in a more dangerous world, a very complicated world, whether we're talking COVID, whether we're talking a more aggressive position from China, I'm just saying, actually New Zealand needs to be a little less complacent. We need to be a bit more clear-sighted. And part of my cry, and it sounds old-fashioned, but I don't mean it as such. I think it's as I say, clear-sighted and future-focused, is we have to, without being silly about it, remember who our friends have been, who share our values, and who stick up for right time and time again. Whether it's human rights issues, whether it's Afghanistan, and that has been countries like Britain, the United States, although President Biden is in a power of trouble at the moment as we talk around his withdrawal from Afghanistan, whether it's Australia. Australia has had a much more forthright, clear position on China. And that's caused them some pain economically at a level. And I don't even think that New Zealand needs to be quite as forthright and bullish as our Aussie mates have been. But I do think we're perhaps at the moment just trying to kind of see no evil, hear no evil, sell more milk, kiwi fruit, and the like. And we could do better to take a stronger stand sometimes with our friends and partners like Britain, Australia, the United States, and some others, Japan, and the like, for common causes, because right is right, and it's not all right to just kind of sit back quietly. And I do think we look back in a decade, actually history's going to judge little countries like New Zealand if all we're sitting and doing is thinking about trade and not too much about other more significant considerations like freedom, like human rights, like the rule of law.
I'm going to finish up on social media and marriage. There's so many great sections of the book that unfortunately we're not going to have time to cover. The section on your food taste, music, so many topics that we're not going to be able to cover, unfortunately, in time. But I want to dig into these two topics but before we finish. And so I'll start with social media. You talked about the impact of your sort of infamous Facebook post on level 4 lockdown. I personally, from the outside, I didn't realize the impact that had when that post was sort of made, and it was quite worrying in terms of the response of actually getting serious death threats. I mean, that again was something that you get the odd sort of sometimes tweets and stuff that are quite rude and not so nice, but actually getting death threats is something that I think seriously needs to be addressed. But let's talk a bit about that sort of, if you like, that infamous Facebook post on level 4 lockdown.
Well, the Labour Party would disagree with me on this, but here's the thing. On one interpretation of 2021, before COVID-19 became a thing, the party that I was leader of was on track to become the government in an election later that year. And we were actually relatively consistently polling higher than the Labour Party. But COVID came and there was probably rightly a rallying effect around the government, and they were seen to be dealing with it well. And a bunch of other things going on about. And I was sitting there probably frustrated politically, to be honest, but also trying to improve the government's response. There's a bunch of things where I thought they were woefully inadequate and complacent. And sometimes I hit the mark on this Facebook post with our team of 5 million, as our Prime Minister talks about. It didn't. And it was effectively calling for a better response, for a more nuanced response, and New Zealanders didn't like that. And that probably for me was the beginning of the end of my leadership. And so in that regard, you could say I was, victim is the wrong word, but a victim in quotes of COVID-19 and the effect of that in terms of social media. What's amazing, and what I talk about in the book, though, is just something that I know we all kind of know, but even vis-a-vis the mainstream media, the power of social media, it had been a big part of my success as leader of the National Party. We were using it to really go at the government in viral videos and the like that had organic reach above sometimes anything mainstream media had in New Zealand. So it had taken me from hero to zero, and then again to hero, actually, as I did a bunch of soft and cuddly stuff. And now some would say in New Zealand, I'm back as a popular politician that gets good media and the like, and the social media sort of shows that. So social media is now vital part. We all know this, but of modern day politics, of our culture. If I hold a public meeting in my home city on a really good evening with some wind between my sails, actually the best ones, possibly I'll get 250 people. Frankly, on a bad night, I might get 40, right? But of course, social media, that's the new virtual public meeting. Can be many tens of thousands of people, and so yeah, I've learned a lot, sometimes to my peril, about the power of social media. And I think, as one of your prime ministers, David Cameron, once said, and I'm not sure, I don't consider this a swear word, but maybe it is, so you can beep it out if it's too much. Twitter maketh a twat. And it's a powerful tool that must be used wisely, and I haven't always got that right.
It's interesting because I was reading the Facebook post, and I must have read that part in your book about 4 times, your actual post, and on maybe it's the Britishness or whatever. I didn't see much wrong with the response I've seen, and I'm sure you have, in terms of politicians being a lot more critical of COVID governments in power, as opposed to your post. But it does lead me on to something that we've kind of discussed quite a bit on this platform, which was empathy. I'm pretty certain there were some elections that have gone on in the last maybe year or so that I think, had it not been for COVID-19, I'm not sure if they would have won, or maybe won with that level of landslide, because it seems like a lot of leaders nowadays need to be able to show a lot of empathy, and it seems that that seems to be one of the really big driving points. And I think you could argue maybe that's what Jacinda Ardern does so well on that section. But then the conservative in me, I watched a really good podcast with, I think, Jordan Peterson. I think we both talked about him before, and Ben Shapiro, and they talked about how empathy is like it's an emotion like love, like hatred, and it doesn't actually solve anything. So it's almost like that fine balance of being able to show it, but also being able to act. And sometimes, and I felt like this is what kind of happened in your post, which is you don't show enough empathy, therefore anything that you've said is invalid. It doesn't matter. Like you may have made a great point, and like when I was reading, I thought, okay, this is, he's just being critical of the government, he's asking questions, which is what I would want from any opposition, regardless if it's my party or not. But it seems to be maybe the left, social media, it's like this: you've not shown enough empathy, you don't care, therefore you're done. Is that, would you say that's a fair assumption that I'm kind of going?
Actually, in terms of the post, and I probably sound overly defensive, and I don't mean to be, but in hindsight, I don't think you'd find a media outlet today that would say I was wrong. I was probably right. But I know, if I'm being candid with you and upfront and personal about it, I did struggle with the empathy thing. There's a sense probably which New Zealanders felt that, right? They didn't see enough of that. I had grown up in a school of politics where, I suppose, a bit like a plumber, that's how I see a politician. You don't really care about the chat. You want them to come along and fix your toilet, so you can use it, right? And I was focused on the achievements and the bricks and mortar. We would make sure we fixed the transport infrastructure, built houses, got the economy going, had a decent health system, all of these kind of tangible bricks and mortar deliverables. Whereas Jacinda Ardern, and I hope none of this sounds dismissive, actually, because it's a remarkable skill she has, she delivered that empathy. We would say, again, I think rightly, but I would say this: a government has been fundamentally pretty poor on that bricks and mortar delivery, right? They haven't built houses, they haven't fixed transport issues, they haven't, in health and so on. We could point to how things are getting worse, right? But your point sort of has got it. For many voters, they want that. We talked about it off air: authenticity, that empathy, They want to see inside your soul or have a sense of your decency or something. Yeah, I was maybe too old-fashioned. I was kind of trying to worry about the content of what we were doing in our policies and so on, rather than um, and again, it's the wrong word because I don't want to sound dismissive of it, because it's where we're at, and where we're at is by definition right, if that's what voters think. But the style of something, which does seem to matter so much in 2021.
I think in a COVID world, it seems to be so important. I don't want to go into lots of different elections, but we had someone quite senior from the States who basically kind of said that if it wasn't for COVID-19, he believes Trump would have won. And one of Trump's biggest weaknesses was his inability to show empathy. And what a lot of people wanted to see during COVID-19 was somebody who could be empathetic, and somebody who could see that people are dying and show that kind of. I think naturally, aside from Trump, but I think as conservatives generally, sort of center right, I think our skills always kind of more on reason and on, like you say, fixing things, as opposed to I think doing the empathetic stuff, having that focus on style and stuff. So it's interesting to see that almost translates into New Zealand as well, because I think it's very relevant in the UK and across the globe. I suppose a lighter and nicer topic to finish on is marriage. You discuss it quite a bit in the book, and it's a really nice segment in your book, and you talk about the importance that your wife has had, Natalie, how she's almost made you a bit more left-leaning at times, and you've had probably the influence on her on the right. How important has she been during this sort of political journey that you've been on?
Great question. And look, I've got to tell you, she's sort of over there in another part of the living room I'm in, so I can only say positive things at the moment. I just thought, when I'm talking about identity and what shapes us, I couldn't go past our partners. In my case, my marriage to Natalie. It's improved me so much. And I flippantly, I don't know if this kind of work, you can get this, or I'm sure you do, but you look at people and they have an animal, and they seem to somehow become more like their pets and look more like their pets, and and life partners are like that too. We shape each other, we become more like each other. And Natalie has made me a better person in so many different ways, and I like to think, hopefully, possibly, maybe I have her as well. In politics, there's a bunch of ways you can deal with a partner. You can kind of push them to the side if you like, and maybe that's what they want, and they're not involved in your career and you're not involved in theirs, and you come together in the weekend or whatever, and that's all very nice. Or you can kind of live in and out of each other's pockets, and that's the way Natalie and I have been. We talk every day a lot, even when I'm in our parliament, the equivalent of your Westminster, away from the home city we live in. We're talking every day, and she is a massive beneficial influence on me. If it wasn't for her, I'd be even more of a weirdo, frankly. I would be living in a sterile apartment with takeaway microwave meals and maybe one pot plant if you were lucky, and a pile of books and that. But marriage, children, they force you to be less selfish, to be more of a normal human being. And I'm not fully there, but I'm certainly grateful to Natalie for taking me a long way down that journey.
I think that's a great way to end this event. It's been fantastic speaking to you, Simon, and to all of our listeners. I do thoroughly recommend getting the book. It's I think, like we touched on earlier in this event, that I think it will appeal to so many different types of people. For me, it was really the race, nationality that really struck me and moved me and made me think about lots of different questions. And I'm sure other people reading may really go into the marriage side of things, whether it's the masculinity, whether it's the class stuff that's going on. So I think it's definitely a book that caters for a very wide range of people. So yeah, thank you for your time, Simon. And I know we've said this quite a few times, but hopefully not too far in the distant future, we'll be doing one of these events in person and physically.
I know we will. Yeah, it's very hard to predict when it will be, but it's going to happen. And look, just thank you so much for having me on. It's been a real pleasure. I'm just want to apologise to you and the listeners. I've probably talked too much. We should have. I should have allowed for more of a genuine conversation, but I've certainly enjoyed it and appreciated what a good conversationalist you have been. So thank you.
Thank you for your time, everyone, and hopefully you enjoy our event, and look out on our website and our social media for more up and coming events.